Hello, everyone. Thank you all for joining us today for this conversation. We're really excited to have our panelists joining us, as well as all of you. We're hoping that we can shed some light on the really interesting work that we've been doing in the burgeoning field of participatory investing and share a bit more about our experiences, as well as some of the work that we see as potential in this field as well. I'm Sonia Sarkar. I have been very excited and fortunate to be working as a co-lead and facilitator on the Participatory Investing Action Lab that Common Future hosted over this past year. And just a little bit about my background, I started off in the space of public health, really interested in exploring different ways for communities and their expertise to be centered in how we think about healing and how we think about thriving. And that brought me to the space of economy and really understanding the intersection between the ways in which capital flows through our systems, particularly in the healthcare system, and what that means for people and their livelihoods and how they're making decisions. And so part of the reason I was really drawn to this concept of participatory investing is because I see there as being sort of extraordinary potential for spaces in institutions as well as in communities where we can open up and democratize processes around capital and really ensure that those that have lived experience of racial inequities, economic inequities, and health inequities are brought into decision making, brought into strategy design, and of course, solutions design and process design as well. So I was really just happy and I think excited to be able to do some burgeoning work in this field with Common Future, and was really honored to be able to join my colleague, Catherine Witt, who from the Common Future team, who's with us here today. So for today's panel, we have some really incredible speakers. We'll have them introduce themselves and share a bit more about their experiences in the Participatory Investing Action Lab. And I will also say that just a little bit about the organization that I was coming in through. I wear a couple of different hats, but have been lucky to work with a number of organizations under the umbrella of Healing Capital, which is an initiative that really seeks to democratize decisions and dollars and data as they relate to healing and thriving communities. My pronouns are she, her, and I will pass it off to Catherine to just lead us through a bit of introduction and some questions to get to know all of you in the audience as well.
Thank you so much, Sonia. Yeah, it's been such a pleasure working with this group of folks over the past 18 months, maybe almost 2 years now, putting this body of work together and getting all of these brilliant insights. So really thrilled to be on the call today. My name's Catherine Witt. I'm the Director of Funder Learning at Common Future. My pronouns are she, her, and I'm based out of Denver, Colorado. And just to kick us off to get a better idea of who's in the room, we wanted to send out a few poll questions. So first, we know that this work touches a lot of different pieces within philanthropy, both practitioners and funders and other folks in the ecosystem. So wanted to get a better sense of who's in the room. Casey, if you want to get that poll started. So we'll give folks just about 30 seconds, a minute or so to answer. This is great. We have a pretty even mix of folks kind of across the spectrum, which is wonderful. And we recognize that this body of work really touches a bunch of pieces of the ecosystem: funders, practitioners, consultants and philanthropic support networks, other ecosystem players as well. So thank you so much for all of you joining us. And then maybe we can kick off the second question. So this poll is specifically for the funders in the room. And then we'll have one more for everyone. So for the funders, where are you in your participatory investing journey? So that ranges from we're not at all familiar with participatory investing, and this is a very kind of nascent space and learning space for us, to we know what it is and we are hoping to make shifts and are kind of in the process of making those shifts. And then the last one being, we already practice some of this in some form or another. So we'll give folks another few seconds to answer. Perfect. Yeah, so again, we have a bit of a range, more folks that have been practicing it in some form or who are aware of it, and a few that are very new and looking to learn. And this is perfect. This is the exact place where you should be. So we're excited to have all of you here. And then the last question, which is on a personal level. And then for those of you who aren't funders, where are you in your knowledge of participatory investing or within your own journey? So I don't know what it is, and I'm here to learn. I know what it is kind of like conceptually, but like in practice, maybe it gets a little more fuzzy and I'm not sure I could name examples. And then the last one is like, I know what it is, I can share some examples, and I understand what it could look like in an applied way too. We give folks another few seconds for that. Great. Yeah. Casey, do you want to share the results? Perfect. Yeah, so we have a huge, chunk of folks in the middle who and I think this is where a lot of us were 2 years ago, 18 months ago, maybe even a year ago, when we started this process, which was like, that sounds like a great idea. I can kind of get it. Like, I get the power sharing, I get that stuff. But when it gets down to the nitty gritty of what it could look like within an institution, not quite sure where to start yet. So hopefully after this webinar and after some conversations with these really smart folks on the call, you'll have a better idea of what that could look like in practice. And to those who are just learning, this is the great space for that as well. And really excited to have some folks that are a little bit more seasoned within this sector and within this work too. So welcome all of you. Thank you all so much for joining and for helping us get a better sense of the folks that are on the call too. And I'll kick it back to Sonia.
Thanks, Catherine. Yes, I think the results very much resonate in terms of what we saw in the Action Lab and why people came into this work, where they were at in terms of their understanding of this concept, and then where we were able to go in terms of establishing a bit of shared language and definition to be able to test. So I wanted to share a bit about the structure of the Participatory Investing Action Lab and talk a bit about our process that we went through. And we're happy to dive into that deeper as we speak to our panelists, Smitha and Tina, as well as answer questions about it. But first, just to start with a bit of a definition setting around participatory investing, we recognize that this is still a space where there's a lot of experimentation and testing to be done. And as a result, when we brought together the 8 philanthropic organizations that were part of this learning and action cohort, we decided that we wanted to first start with really establishing a shared basis and having language that we could at least put up as a starting point and then try to evolve it over time. So as all of the folks in this Action Lab came together, we went through an iterative process to put together a definition and decided that for this group, participatory investing would refer to an investing approach that ensures that communities that have been historically excluded and harmed by traditional investment practices and structures are holding meaningful power and ownership over capital strategy, capital design, implementation, and outcomes. So really trying to be comprehensive in terms of how we think about this overarching investment process. And so as we started the work with all of the participants in the cohort, we brought in a pretty intensive learning curriculum. So we were able to feature different speakers, organizations, funds that are already exploring this concept or exploring different aspects of participatory work, community-led work, community ownership, to be able to just learn, ask questions, understand the case studies that exist in the field already. And simultaneously, we also had the members of the cohort start to think about an actionable project inside of their institutions that could fall under this umbrella of participatory investing. And Catherine will talk a little bit more about some of the specific areas where we've started to see that work take place and some of the tools that we developed in order to support that work. But really wanted folks to be able to think specifically about where there might be an opportunity to do something that has traction inside of their organization that really does engage community at a deeper level than has been happening previously, that connects to sort of deep racial equity work and other types of equity work inside of the organization. And so in addition to support from different community advisors and expert advisors on the technical projects, we also had a third layer to the cohort, which was a pooled fund of $175,000 that each of the organization participants put money into. And there was then a collaborative participatory process to think through what those funds could be used for. And throughout that process, we actually brought in community leaders through Shift Health Accelerator, as well as other leaders within Common Futures Network, to advise on both what the potential design and strategy of that fund could be. And then they actually ended up playing a specific role in decision-making around the investments that ultimately received funding from this pool. And one thing, a couple of learnings that I'll just share that we'll be able to expound upon later in the panel is that we found that there was, as you can imagine, a lot of interest in how do we actually think about participatory investing from a tactical perspective. So many of you said, I know what this looks like conceptually, but I'm really curious about what it means to translate it into action. And so we did, a fair amount of work and learning just to say, okay, if I were really to bring in community members into a particular aspect of my investment process, how do I define community? How do I think about those relationships and the trust building there? What particular part of a process am I bringing them into? And how do I think about having that be as early as possible, but still having definition for my institution so that there's a clear place for people to plug in and have access to information. And so a second lesson that I think that really emerged from that we found very interesting was that particularly as cohort participants were working with our community experts, our community advisors, who were bringing in their insights from the field and were subject matter experts in the intersection of health and healing and wealth building, which is where we ultimately focused the fund. We also saw that there was a tension between this idea of really creating spaces where community leaders are owning and driving decisions, and then the role that the institution plays as part of that. So to what extent do you continue to have an active role and not relinquish responsibility, but also have space, true space, for people to step into, governance and other types of decision processes as well. So we'll talk about that a little bit. And then I think the third lesson that has really sort of resonated as we've come out of this is that there is no one correct way to tackle participatory investing. It truly is diverse and variable and has to really align with both your community stakeholders and the places in which you work, as well as your institution's culture. And so that is really part of our aspiration for this work, is that we're able to see lots of different proof points that show the various pathways that can be taken within this work as well. So with that, Catherine, I will hand it over to you to just talk a little bit about the toolkit that has emerged from this process as well.
Thank you so much, Sonia. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and we can do a little bit of a live walkthrough of the toolkit. And as Sonia said, so much of the purpose of what we were hoping to accomplish with the Action Lab over the past year plus was really to then document our learnings and share out what we were from our successes, from our challenges, from learnings, what we can format and shape what we've done through this toolkit to help other folks get started a little bit easier into this work and to help catalyze the field as a whole as well. So this is the landing page for our toolkit. On this page, you can find a little bit of background about the Action Lab. You can find our definition that Sonia shared earlier, and you can find a little bit of explanation as to why participatory, why investing, and then you can also find this toolkit chapter section. And this really gives you an overview of what's to come throughout the toolkit to give you a better idea of how it's structured and the work that you're going to be engaging in throughout it. So we'll get started with the thing that Sonia mentioned as well, one of the things, which is really the importance of defining and understanding your community. So we've heard and we experienced how important it was to really deeply understand and be on the same page about who we're talking about when we're trying to get folks to participate in processes, and who we're talking about when we're trying to shift power. We have some resources here. We have some of our community principles from Common Future that we use, and we have a few questions here, which we hope will be helpful for you all getting started when you're trying to collaboratively and get to the same page around defining who your community is when you're talking about this work. So it could be, some questions could be, who is your primary constituent group and who is the most marginalized and under-resourced within that? Who are the people that are often excluded from the table? And what does it look like to have lived experience within the context of the challenges that your capital aims to address? And then this last point, which I think is maybe the most important, is how do the people your institution serves define their own community? We've heard time and time again how important it is for institutions to ask and listen to the community that they're serving around their own perspectives about themselves and how they define these different pieces of the work too. So we'll move on after you've kind of, established who your community is and have come to an agreement about that. We encourage you to take the readiness quiz. And this really is intended to understand whether your institution is even ready to engage in this type of work. So it talks about and asks you to consider the types of norms and beliefs and culture that you have within your institution, and whether or not those are conducive to starting this participatory investing work or continuing it. So I believe there's about 8 questions in here, and you can click on this little button to go through the quiz, and there's a section at the end where you can insert your email and get your own results. One thing that we also found throughout this process is how important it is to bring others along within your institution as you navigate and build out your strategy. And we think that these quizzes that we've embedded throughout this toolkit are a really great way to do that. So sending this quiz to your colleague or to maybe a board member or during a board meeting and asking folks to fill it out and then comparing results and seeing where there might be alignment or where there might be some dissonance and maybe some place to do a little bit more work. So after you've analyzed kind of like where you are in your culture and where you are in terms of the necessary foundational pieces that need to be in place before you move forward within your participatory investing journey, then we move on to the participatory standards. And these we've really outlined are the non-negotiables that need to be kind of front of mind when you engage in this work. So there's 11 that we've outlined, and they are things like building trust and being accountable. They are things like modeling transparency and compensating folks. So wherever you are within your participatory investing journey, we deeply believe that these non-negotiables, these standards, should be at the foundation of your work and should be considered kind of at every step along the way. So after you've read kind of these and assessed whether or not you have the ability or the current structure to be able to include these, then we invite you to take our second quiz, which is a short 4-question quiz. And it starts to map out what we've developed as our kind of like core framework. And it maps the 4 functions that we've defined. So those are like MRI and PRI work, mission aligned investing, programmatic related investment work, investment committee work, investment strategy work, and endowment work. And it maps those up with the community engagement spectrum that was developed by Rosa Gonzalez. And it starts to, this will give you a starting point from where your institution is currently. And we know that we often need to know where we are to understand better where we can go and what goals we can set moving forward. So that's really the intention here. And as Sonia mentioned, the nonlinearity. There's a reason why there's all these squiggly lines back and forth. We know that it's not a to B to C process. In fact, it is often an A to F or an A to E, and then you go back to C. And there's a lot of different iterations that happen. And a lot of this happens when you are listening to your community about what their needs are, understanding the context that you're coming from within your own institution, and matching those 2 things and better aligning the work moving forward accordingly. So on this page, we've done a little bit of a deeper dive too into how we define the different kind of verticals within the spectrum of engagement. So you can dig into that to better understand. And then we go into the kind of like meat of the framework, where you can pick kind of which function within your investment work in your institution you'd like to dig into. And so for this example, we'll just pick investment strategy. At the top of the page, it'll have a reminder about the participatory standards and the spectrum of engagement definitions if you want to dig back into those. And then it really provides more tangible, concrete examples of what this work can look like within an institution at each of these verticals. So if you look at inform within the context of investment strategy, some examples are publishing your investment policy statement publicly, or disclosing projected grant making and endowment budgets for the year ahead. This is a lot around transparency. And if you want to dig into something a little bit further, or maybe you're looking to move a lot further along that spectrum, if you want to go into the sharing power, it could look like giving the community members a majority or complete decision-making power or veto power over your institution's investment strategy or goals or your investment policy statement. And so as you can spend a lot of time kind of like clicking in and out of these different layers and exploring, and we encourage you to do so. Given whatever is appropriate for your institution, and then kind of setting goals accordingly. And so I think one thing I want to emphasize too is this toolkit is really intended to be a starting place. This field is very nascent, and we recognize that. And our hope is, and the intention is, that there's a lot of iteration that happens around this, and that this is not a complete A to Z soup to nuts instruction manual for how to carry out this work, but really it is a starting point for folks to begin their work and then hopefully continue and carry forward and share with us their learnings so that we can then further catalyze the field and support other folks within this work. So with that, I'll pass it back to Sonia.
Great. Thank you, Catherine. We're very much looking forward to now diving into hearing from two of our participants in the Action Lab. And I'll start with Smitha. If you could just tell us your name, your pronouns, your organization, and then your role within the institution and how that touches on the concept of participatory investing. And then my question for you is, why did you decide that participatory investing was something that you and your organization wanted to do or explore, and how did you start out exploring it? What learning objectives did you set?
Absolutely. Well, thanks so much, Sonia and the Common Future team, for hosting this webinar. It's been wonderful working with you over the past year and a half, almost 2 years on this project. I'm Smitha. I use she, her pronouns. I work at World Education Services, which is a nonprofit social enterprise, and oversee our impact and mission investing team. And this work is really central to how we think about impact at WES. When we are defining impact, we think about it as threefold. We think about who we're investing in, what we're investing in, and importantly, how we're investing and supporting our partners. So as we think about all three of those dimensions, for the who, at WES, we're centered around advancing economic, social inclusion for immigrants, refugees, communities of color. Our what is focused on advancing opportunity, wealth, power, and justice for these communities. And our how is looking to demonstrate a trust-based approach, an approach which centers our values of justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion, or JEDI. And so as we were in this work, really trying to develop practices, we came across, of course, the Common Future team and the emerging work they were doing around participatory investing. And it just so resonated with our own perspective of our values and how we want to show up as an investor. And so we very early on decided to partner more formally with the Common Future team on this project, think about how can we really create this cohort to learn across different types of models of participatory investing. There's a few out there, and there's more to be demonstrated in the future. And so it was really a learning year. And one of the milestones of it was this toolkit that we launched a few months ago. And so it's exciting to bring this to you all to get your feedback and thoughts. And to Catherine's point, it's a live document, so we're hoping to iterate on it in the coming months and years.
Great, thanks for that. You mentioned JEDI and the principles that WES holds that really lend themselves to creating a supportive environment for exploring something like participatory investing. I'm wondering if you can talk about whether there were other aspects of your organizational context or structure that enabled you all to really step into this particular concept.
Absolutely. I mean, participatory investing is ultimately looking to reimagine the how of investing. And to do that, you do need to have a core foundation. And so that's why we got really excited about the readiness quiz and this idea that there is actually a step before you jump into some of this work around participatory investing. Sonia, you said earlier on, there's many different ways to do participatory investing, but there's also ways you can do it in a way that could be extractive or causing harm. And so how do you make sure you have the right foundation and set of values? And so for Wes, we certainly have values around JEDI and trust-based practices. I think another important piece of the puzzle is having a supportive board. And so over the course of the years, as we've started doing grant making, impact investing at Wes, we have an incredibly supportive board and have been able to build trust with them over the few years. And so I'll share more about how that has affected the way that we've been able to shift decision making away from the board, actually, and think about centering those who are more proximate to the problems.
Great. And if you could pick one or two functions from the toolkit where you feel like your institution is really doing some bit of deep dive now, what are those functions? Where are you hoping to get to, both in terms of the big vision aspirationally, but also just from a very pragmatic perspective? What are some of the things that you're working on, and projects, avenues, et cetera?
Absolutely. Well, a few different things. As always, we're a work in progress at Wes, and always looking to improve and really do think about this with a learning orientation, that we're not there yet, but we're in the process. So a few different aspects of that toolkit, that the 4 functions resonated with us in our work. For example, on the program related investments, or as we call it, our catalytic impact investments, we're looking at various ways to incorporate additional voices in the way that we make decisions and shape our strategy. And so, for example, with the board, about February of last year, we shifted decision-making power for any asset allocations around grants or impact investments from board to staff, which was a huge shift and also a vote of confidence in the team. And that was a great moment for us to think about how can we move decisions to those who are closest to the work. And our team is a team of individuals with lived, learned, and labored experiences, but then also how do we broaden the set of voices and who's at the table when decisions are made. And so that's where we're actually looking both on grant making and impact investing around what are additional voices we can bring in to inform where capital goes, and think about Wes's role more as a facilitator of capital rather than a deployer of capital. And that's been a bit of a mindset behavior shift for us as a funder. Another real-time example is that we are in the midst of updating our investment policy statement. So as a social enterprise, we made a carve out for catalytic impact investments, but we also continue to grow the corpus from our business and our top line revenues. And so essentially our endowment is invested currently in the markets with no particular alignment to mission, let alone participatory approaches. So we're in an active conversation with our board to align that capital with our mission and values. And one way that we're trying to move along that spectrum of engagement, I would say, transparently, we're at the non-participation part of that spectrum. Most of our partners don't really even know that our IPS exists, let alone what's in it. And so how can we be much more open and transparent with that pool of capital or endowment, and think about bringing in additional voices. So we're doing a few things. One is certainly board engagement. We have several experts in the participatory investing space who are speaking to our board. We also are having a partner convening of our investee partners in the fall, and looking to really just open the doors and be much more transparent around the process, what we hope to include in the new investment policy statement, and get feedback and move towards the more involved, collaborate side of that spectrum. And so that's our ambition. I imagine if we do a webinar in a few months, end of the year, maybe we'll have a more positive update on that. But I will say, this work takes time. It is a behavioral shift. And it is also a moment where we have to make sure that we're bringing folks along the journey, right? It's not just myself and my team on the impact investing side. We need to bring our board along the journey, our senior team, our partners, community, and that takes time.
Thank you for that. I just want to encourage folks to add questions or reflections in the chat. We are monitoring that, and we'll incorporate your questions into our Q&A session. But I wanted to lift up a particular insight that you're naming, Smitha, which I think is around information transparency and education and awareness building at a number of levels, at the board level, with respect to investee partners that you would hope to bring in. And so really sort of creating that environment where folks can then actually step in to be part of a collaborative process or a participatory process. And so that makes a lot of sense. Thank you for that. I will now turn to you, Tina. If you could also share your name, your pronouns, your institution, and your role within the institution. And I am curious as well, why did you decide for you and your institution that participatory investing was something that you wanted to explore, and what were some of the learning objectives that you all had in mind?
Thanks, Sonia. Good morning and good afternoon, depending on what part of the country or countries you are today. My name is Tina Assefa. My pronouns are she, her, and I serve as the Director of Learning and Innovation at the California Wellness Foundation. So perhaps it's not a surprise that learning is in my title, because as Smitha has already alluded to, I think learning is really the stance that's needed when you are creating a new path for your organization, as well as really for our sector in terms of how we think about deploying our capital. I come from a place where, at least in my experience, it's been most common in the philanthropic sector for us to design strategies to address the problems that we know exist today, and less on investing to proactively build the futures we want to see. And here at Cal Wellness, we understand that wealth is the single most important factor that influences health. And for much of our history, we've spent a lot of time and staff resources focused on the 5% payout, where we spend our time doing our grant making, and far less time thinking about the other 95%. But several years ago, we made a commitment to proactively align all of our resources, including our investments, to align with our mission, centering racial and economic equity. And it's in that journey that this work around participatory investing really became an opportunity for me in my role, specifically in the learning and innovation space, where I serve as essentially the R&D arm for the foundation, to see what trends are emerging and begin to leverage some resources to seed experiments that can help us think about how we might support new models or approaches that stretch our thinking about how change happens, what structures are needed to create the future we want to see. And it's specifically in this capacity that I had access to some grant and program-related investment dollars to support those experiments. And specifically joining the Action Lab, what drew me to this work was to be part of a community of practice among other funders like Smitha, who are committed to JEDI, are interested in exploring how to democratize investments in a way that supports and fosters thriving and resilient communities. I myself was trying to figure out on my own what are some examples of things that are already out there. And being a part of this learning community gave me a broader sense of the range of models and approaches to think about how we can use our investment capital to support power sharing, and really ultimately, in my mind, strengthen democratic practices in our community at a time where in this country, democracy is really at a place where we can't take it for granted. Taking inspiration from other members of the cohort was really a powerful opportunity, I think, for me. Sitting in my role, Smitha sits in a very different role in her institution, and we had other perspectives represented in the cohort. So being able to draw from each of our individual roles and organizational contexts by learning about participatory investing through the process of creating both a path forward and also a toolkit, ultimately helped us understand, I think, and really grow what, for me at least, feels like a nascent field, where community members were at the table with funders making decisions about how to deploy our capital. And, you know, at the end of the day, we know we can't do this alone. And I'm really hopeful that with all of you here showing so much interest in this new area of participatory investing, that I'm really excited to see how we can deploy that collective billions of dollars that we hold as foundations and investment capital to really shift some longstanding practices in our individual institutions.
Great. Thank you, Tina. And I appreciate you lifting up also some of the facilitating factors inside of Cal Wellness that enable this, both in terms of having some grant making support for existing models and having this commitment to learning. I'm curious if you could also talk a bit about, when you look at the functions of the toolkit, if there are particular areas where you're interested to explore or do additional support work as Cal Wellness continues on this learning journey.
Absolutely. So we're a statewide health foundation where community voice has long been a part of our institutional DNA. We have both grantees and community members who serve as trustees on the board, and we have increasingly voiced our commitment to exploring ways in which we can be transparent, not just with what we fund, but also how we fund and who's at the decision-making table. More recently, we've started to pay attention to who manages our endowment. So we've really made a significant shift in moving to make sure that the folks who manage our assets actually have themselves lived or labored experience around issues that are aligned with our priorities. And we have added community members on the investment committee, currently non-voting members, but they are joined by other community members who are members of the board who make decisions around how we deploy any of our program-related investments. And myself, I'm part of a staff committee that's comprised of both the finance side and the programmatic side of our foundation, where I found it really powerful that we bring our different perspectives to the work. And through that, it's really where I think we've been able to move in our PRI work from the informed stage to, in some cases, the shared power on the spectrum of engagement. And so we're actually straddling, I would say, both ends of that spectrum. We do publicly talk about our MRI and PRIs on our website and in philanthropic spaces. And we've made several investments in the past couple of years to begin to seed the field of participatory investing, honestly, before we even had a name for it. What we were interested in is exploring what it means to build community power and really testing different ways of community governance, where it's ultimately stakeholders who have meaningful input and can help shape decisions around how that capital is deployed. And I'm happy to share, if anyone's interested, some specific examples of how we've blended both grant and investment capital to try to seed a variety of different models here in California to begin to build the field.
You know, I might build on that for a minute, just because one is a common investee partner for us, which is, I think, in addition to looking at our own practices of our institutions and how we can be more participatory and broaden the voices at the table, we're also looking at how can we seed and demonstrate more participatory models in the field. And so that's where we've invested. Both of us have invested in the Real People's Fund. For example, Wes has also invested in Boston Impact Initiative, Community Credit Lab, that now has become part of Common Future. So we're looking at a lot of different models and asking questions in our diligence processes around how is worker voice, worker power centered in the model. And that's across investment types, in our venture investments, early stage, in our shared ownership investments and worker ownership structures, for example, or home ownership, even real estate. We're looking at models where worker voice is centered and also reflected in the governance structures of these investment funds. So I'll just offer that, because there's a lot of really interesting and emerging funds out there, which are almost they're pioneering different governance models, and we're trying to invest in those funds to learn and see what we can integrate within the Wes institution.
Absolutely. Yeah, I appreciate both of you raising this point, because I do want to caveat that while participatory investing may be new to explore in an institutional context, there are, of course, community entities that have been engaging with collaborative forms of governance and shared power and worker ownership and many other cooperative forms of working. And so, where is there opportunity to really both support that infrastructure as well as learn from it as well? So I wanted to turn to a couple of the questions that we're getting through the Q&A. And Smitha, I believe this question related to what you were sharing about the board, but this basically sort of trying to understand what were the types of questions that your board asked before they were comfortable with delegating authority over allocation decisions for staff. And are there any ongoing governance, oversight, reporting, et cetera, in order to ensure that that stays in place?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I will say it didn't happen overnight. We started with putting in some bounds and creating a delegation of authority table. So some of the questions the board asked, particularly around the way we make grants, the way we make investments, was for each of the early grants and investments we did, getting a really good sense of the investment memos. We used to send to them all of our grant recommendation memos, and also investment memos where they would read, and we would have these really interactive conversations. I think over time, the nature of those conversations ended up being a little bit more of a formality almost, because the depth of the questions weren't necessarily changing the outcome. And so over that, we build trust, right? And we're showing insight into how we're sourcing, how we're diligencing, how we're capable of building these relationships with our partners that are so trust-based and deep in relationship. And so how can we use that as a way to bring that to the board and almost revisit the relationship we have with our board? Now I would offer that our relationship with the board is much more strategic. We're having conversations at beginning of program initiatives where we're getting a sense of how can we shape this, and getting their input as well as it relates to the broader goals for WES and the future growth of the company. But we're also trying to package the learnings and share it with them and see how we can bring that to the field. And so just the nature of the types of conversations and discussions, it's much more generative, I would say, rather than maybe more of a transactional relationship that we were having previously. And we started with saying anything, for example, under $1 million would be approved by staff. Then that goes up, right? Up and up and up. And then over time, we had this moment where we had a conversation with the committee chair, and we said, well, why don't we try to increase the threshold again? And then he said, well, why don't we remove the threshold? And that was board led. So, I think part of it is also building champions. And he was such a great champion and a committee chair, and was able to present this to his peers, which is a really powerful way to go about it versus, say, us presenting it to the board directly.
Yeah, super helpful. Thank you for outlining all that. Oh, Tina, anything you want to share on that as well?
I just wanted to chime in and say, similarly, I think the importance is both the internal work we have to do in terms of our own learning, but also bringing in outside voices to the board to help move them along, because as we are doing this work, it's not always visible what other institutions are doing, especially for boards. And in our case, it was helpful to be able to talk about how this is really a shift in practice, not just for us in terms of the level of the amount of the approvals that ultimately get to the boards, and really creating some comfort that if we're aligned in terms of what the values and goals are, that there's also an opportunity to really trust the staff who are closer to the work in terms of day-to-day to be able to move some key pieces of work forward. And that releases some of the issues around our ability to be responsive to communities as well in a timely fashion, because most of us operate on a quarterly cycle for board meetings, and we've been able to shift that. So again, it comes with an inside-outside strategy around moving people's awareness and demonstrating examples of what's possible so that people's own shifting or assumptions can move around what we can do as an institution.
Great. Thank you for sharing that. A question for both of you as well is, as you were thinking about this shift from a market approach to a mission aligned approach for investment strategy and investment management, what are some of the steps that are part of that transition? And how do you all think about that in the context of each of your different institutions? Whoever wants to start.
Well, maybe Tina, you should start because you've made the shift to mission. I can tell you the real-time conversation. We're even having a board meeting on Tuesday where we're trying to put a little bit more on the table around how much of our capital we want to align with mission, with the working assumption that it's 100%.
So this is where I wish our CFO was on the webinar, because she really, with our CEO, has led this effort. We really started, I would say, around 2017, 2018, to begin to have conversations with our board. As I mentioned, we have community members and grantees who are already represented on the board, and we've increasingly talked about how do we center our commitments around racial equity and justice as a through line in our work. And it felt hard to do that with only 5% of our funds. We really understood that to accomplish our mission, we need to look at its entirety of our assets. And it's with that intention that we started to have board conversations and really spent 2 years around learning with the board. And then we did carve-outs. We started out with a much smaller amount of money, both on the MRI and PRI side, to experiment, just so we would have some tangible examples to bring back and help them understand what it would take, and help us as staff understand what it will take to really shift. And I would say while we were able to demonstrate success and move the needle, we've made the commitment for 100% alignment. I would not say we're there yet, but what I will say that I'm proud of is, as part of that journey, we went from having almost no asset managers who were themselves identified as having lived experience or labored experience in the communities that we are most invested in, to be able to really have over half of our asset managers now bringing that voice and experience. And that in and of itself, and working with the board, has also allowed us to begin to identify new opportunities to be able to move our dollars. So we're not at the end of the journey, but we're very much well on our way.
I would add that for us, it was really starting with the why as a social enterprise, making the case that we want to reimagine fiduciary duty for a social enterprise, thinking about it both as financial stewardship of the organization as well as mission stewardship, in that those are deeply intertwined as we think about our business model. And so I would say for 18 months before we even created a mission investing board committee, we were making that case and building consensus and understanding of the why. Then we go into the what, and that's where we are right now with the investment policy statement update. And we're having this intention to call it a mission investing policy statement with this 100% alignment. And through that process, we actually took some of the playbook of Cal Wellness and others by bringing in external advisors and broadening the table a bit of who's informing the IPS update. And those individuals also reflect a diverse lived, learned, labored experience. And so having a non-voting external advisor is a way, is kind of a lower barrier way to bring in additional voices. You're not asking for a new board member necessarily, but you're able to broaden the set of voices. And also we're bringing in external expert advisors to speak. We're packaging learning. So it really is a very active board engagement learning process that I imagine never really ends. It just continues and it evolves, and we'll get to the next point where we get into the how in the implementation piece, to Tina's point. And a commitment is not necessarily that you're there day one, right? It takes years. And then for us, as the way that we have demonstrated our impact on the impact investing side, that carve out around the who, the what, the how, like how do we bring those values, particularly around our innovation and the how, to the endowment? And that's the work that we're really excited to demonstrate and also package and share with the field to the extent it's helpful.
Great. Thank you for that. We have two questions in the chat that I think are related, which is really around, as you start to put together a participatory process, how long does it take for your organizations to go from the planning phase to actually perhaps executing with community members or others that you're bringing in? And I think relatedly, how might we think about informing community stakeholders that you're working with about this type of work and that they can be part of a participatory investing process? So curious how both of you are thinking about those questions, knowing that it's an iterating process, of course.
So I would say we are very much early in our journey around that. And so where we've started is to actually, first of all, it took at least 2 years to even socialize this as an idea internally with staff. And then, as I've mentioned earlier, it's been important to bring some concrete examples of what it can look like or what it has already looked like externally in terms of demonstrating examples of what participatory could look like when we invest in a fund or invest in an effort where community members absent really any decision-making on the part of the foundation, decide how to deploy that capital and what's meaningful for them in terms of how those dollars are used to support goals that are in alignment with our mission. And I would say our role has really been, as Smitha has already mentioned, how do we show up as partners, not to be extractive, but to really take a stance of being in partnership with, understanding that we can't accomplish our mission as a foundation if we don't change or at least understand how we can support more growth in wealth and power in community. We have not yet brought that directly into how we practice our own decisions around where we invest our dollars more broadly with our endowment. Or frankly, I want to also clarify, we don't have a participatory grant-making process within our institution yet. So what I would say is the place to start is to be able to bring concrete examples and to be able to identify both external allies and people internally who can help demonstrate a proof of concept and be willing to share some of the experiments and learnings, knowing that not everything's going to succeed right away. And frankly, be willing to take risks that won't necessarily lead to a win every time. And once we have more comfort and familiarity with that, I think it'll open it up where we can think more broadly about what those processes could look like if we were to bring more voices inside the organization and not just in how we deploy our capital externally.
Wonderful. Well, before I turn it to Catherine to just talk a little bit about what's next and what we see as some future directions, I'm curious if either of you, both of you, could just highlight any important lessons or takeaways from the cohort that are really sort of staying with you, resonating with you as you continue in this work.
Sure. I mean, I have several, but I'll name two, which I think we highlighted a bit at the beginning. So I would say one is that this process is not linear, and I've experienced this directly in my role at WES as well as in the pooled fund, where we try to have this live experiment of participatory investing in the cohort. So I would remember that that's a way to give ourselves a bit of grace as well in this process, that just because we're not necessarily moving forward in a linear way, it doesn't mean we're not moving forward. It's thinking about the long game and really the shift of mindsets and behaviors at an organization, which maybe takes time and is not always in one direction. And then the second would be how this process has really made me have a bit of an identity crisis almost around what is the role of an investor if you're doing participatory investing. So Sonia said this really well at the beginning, but that shifting power does not mean that you're shifting responsibility. And how can you really just think about it as a shift in the role of an investor? We try to think about it as maybe even changing the word of deploying capital to facilitating capital. But what does that mean in regards to how we show up? Because It just means that maybe the way that our relationship is with our partners is different. And it doesn't mean that we're removing ourselves fully from the process and just, letting our partners decide. That we actually were asked in the pilot, for example, the pooled fund pilot, that they wanted investors to stay in the room during the decision making and really think about it as a sharing of power and not just a full shift of power. So I thought that was a really interesting learning for me and something I'll continue to unpack, I'm sure.
I'll just add, agree with all of those points, Smitha. I would just add, start small and just experiment. Begin to understand what it means. There's no one size fits all for any institution. And so understanding how to move within your organization, given the culture and the practices that may be longstanding, is an important piece. Having patience, because the change isn't going to happen overnight, and understand that a lot of this is relational, both within your institution and with partners that we may be working with externally. And tap folks who are already doing this work, because as I mentioned earlier, having a proof of concept and knowing that your institution is not the only one doing something that's vastly different than it's been doing in the past makes it easier to begin to take those early first steps.
Wonderful. Thank you both. Really appreciate all these insights. And with that, I will pass it to you, Catherine, to just share a bit more about what's next for participatory investing work, how will this work grow, and what can we tell folks who on this call who are interested in exploring more about this field.
Yeah, thank you so much, Sonia and Smitha and Tina. Just massive thanks and appreciation for all the work that y'all have done and will continue to do after this. In terms of next steps, so Common Future, our goal is really to incubate these new ideas. It's really to kind of provide a space and a container for these ideas, these new content areas to grow and to be a little bit more established. And a place to learn and document where those pieces can then catalyze the field. And then it's to work in partnership with other folks to share out this work and to spread the knowledge and get more folks involved and provide more resources to folks who want to be involved. And so to that end, one of our close partners is Jen Lewis-Walden and Sonia Sarkar. They're both leading a number of initiatives, but I'll pass it to Jen to speak a little bit more about the work that they're doing and how they're seeing the future of this as well.
Great. Thank you, Catherine. And hi, everyone. I'm Jen Lewis-Walden, and I'm on the leadership team of Shift Health Accelerator. We were a partner on this project to source community advisors from our national network of grassroots community health equity experts, and also to source projects for the investments of the pooled fund. And we were just really inspired by participating in the project and all of the iterative conversations between community leaders and institutional leaders grappling with these conversations. And we are planning on taking the lessons learned from this work and applying it to another institutional audience in healthcare, and really sort of drawing on the lessons learned from this project and applying things like reframing risk, reframing return, and really conceptualizing what a pay it forward concept would look like for participatory investing in the healthcare space, really holding healthcare institutions accountable to the stated institutional mission of health. And so we're just excited to bring our national network of community leaders to this work, draw on the lessons learned from this project and the toolkit, and apply it to a different institutional audience. And yeah, we're thrilled for next steps in this space and to continue partnership on the field building aspect of this work to continue to identify proof points in the field for other institutional leaders to apply these participatory investing practices.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Jen. And thank you so much to all of our speakers, Sonia, Smitha, Tina. So much gratitude for your time today and for all of the work that you all have done. So yes, please feel free to reach out. We'll be sending a follow-up email with some more resources and a recording. But other than that, thanks so much for joining us today, and we'll hopefully see you soon.